Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. On this podcast, we talk about arts, culture, politics, sport, and anything else worth talking about. Now, today's guest is a journalist, and she's also a member of the House of Lords. It's Claire Fox. Hello, Claire.
Hello, Chris. Great to be with you.
Likewise, likewise. Now, I imagine most of our viewers will know who you are, but just give a quick roundup of basically how you got to this point to be a member of the House of Lords.
Oh, God knows. So I'm the director of the Academy of Ideas, and I've been involved in organising big public debates and discussions and salons, and in trying to ensure that there should be as much and as wide political public conversation as possible, and to ensure that that should not be beholden to the new rules of what you can't say, but rather to encourage people to speak freely and openly. And so I'm kind of was quite well known in relation to that as a journalist as well. So was always on the radio, did Radio 4's Moral Maze for over 20 years, just as an example, but kind of one of those talking heads. Before that, by the way, I'd been a normal person, which was I'd worked with the homeless, I'd been a social worker, I'd also worked with the mentally ill for some years, and I'd been a teacher at further education, teaching English and special needs. And so, then I went on to do the Academy of Ideas work. And I'm saying all that because the shocking thing that happened was just quite straightforwardly that I voted to leave the European Union in 2016, and this somehow became far more controversial than I wanted it to be. And it ended up being that I stood for the Brexit Party in 2019, politically, something I never imagined that I'd ever be on the same platform as Nigel Farage. But I was so desperate to ensure that Brexit happened that I thought it was important to have somebody with a kind of more liberal left-leaning representing that side of the argument. So I stood, got elected, and I think that that is how I ended up in the House of Lords, because when you get offered a peerage, you don't really know why. And let's be honest, I thought when they phoned me, it was a joke and that somebody was like pulling a practical, kind of one of those radio stunts, see how I'd react. But I think the Boris Johnson administration wanted to be seen to acknowledge both the role of the Brexit Party and also the kind of red wall voters who were maybe previously Labour voters who then voted for Boris Johnson. And so there was Kate Hoey, Gisela Stewart, and myself. Kate Hoey and Gisela, ex-Labour Party, me on the left of the Brexit argument and a Brexit Party member. And so that's how I ended up in the House of Lords, which is a long-winded, convoluted answer, but hopefully it gives your listeners something to understand where I came from.
But weren't you initially against the House of Lords in principle?
Yeah.
So why still join as a result of that?
Yeah, I mean, I slam against the notion of a second chamber that decides on the laws of the country when the people who are in that second chamber are unelected. It's obviously a threat to democracy, a challenge to democracy at the very least. And so I didn't just say yes. And in fact, when I got the phone call offering me the peerage, they said, can you please not say anything until we've justified why we're offering it to you? And the first thing they said was, we know you want to abolish the House of Lords. You can carry on saying that if we want. And we know that you're going to say no when we offer you this, but we want you to say yes. So they had me off to a tee. Well, and so I didn't just say yes straight away. I mean, I thought, oh, I can't possibly join the House of Lords. I want to abolish it. But I think that there was two things, and I don't know whether I've made the right decision even to this minute. The work of the Academy of Ideas and the work that we do around free speech and discussion was something that I wanted to get a platform for. It's a fantastic opportunity to talk about those issues in the heart of Parliament. And secondly, and I was slightly convinced by them when they said this, they also pointed out that, I maybe had some obligation to acknowledge on behalf of the Brexit red wall voters that they were offering it to me for that reason. And there was a kind of sense, and I still feel that responsibility, by the way. I feel as though I kind of am, in a faux kind of way, answerable to all of those millions of voters in that category. But there's no doubt about it, it's ambivalent as to whether I should have taken it or not, because you're always going to think, I think this place should be abolished, what am I doing here? But I wouldn't hold back from thinking it should be abolished just because I'm in there, that's the point. But it exists, and while it's there, I try and use it in a way that I think is, helpful.
So in terms of the process of making laws, obviously for those who are listening outside of UK, what is the process? So it goes to the House of Commons first, and then obviously to the House of Lords. What is that process?
Yeah, so the laws are nominated by the elected government. They then have a full discussion in the House of Commons with the elected members of Parliament, and there's rows and arguments about whether the proposed law by the government needs to be amended or changed, or parts removed or whatever. But that happens within the Commons, and then the bill, as agreed by the Commons the first time, is then carried literally, actually, on a silver platter from one corridor down the corridor from the House of Commons over to the House of Lords. We get this bill, and then the role of the constitutional role of this second chamber is that the House of Lords has more time to scrutinise the law, and in theory, it's a chamber that's supposed to not change the law, but to see if the law is fit for the purpose decided by the elected members. So in a way, what you do is you in theory, this isn't what happens, but I'm just saying in theory. In theory, you can say, well, you as the elected chamber say that you want to pass a law that will lock people up for this reason, but actually, if you look at the wording of this law, it's going to lead to all sorts of unintended consequences. And so then you say, well, look, have you thought this law could really be improved if we add in this amendment that will change it slightly and give it a different shift, but one that's in tune with your democratic wishes as the elected house. So that's the theory. Of course, what happens in practice is that this second chamber of the House of Lords acts as though it's almost like an oppositional chamber with its own mind, yeah? And it tends to be that there's lots and lots of amendments, particularly of controversial pieces of legislation. And often the amendments put forward by the Lords would actually rip the heart out of the intention of the original law being passed by the House of Commons. And I consider that to be anti-democratic, and I will often argue that, right? So it's one thing saying to the House of Commons, think again, look at this again, is this really what you intended, or might you just consider that this could have some very dangerous consequences? It's another thing sort of saying what they're doing in the Commons is disgusting, we in the House of Lords know better, which is often the form it takes. So anyway, so we amend the law, there's votes, it's a long process of committee discussions, and then what's called report stage, in which amendments are voted on, and after that the newly amended bill from the House of Lords is sent back on the same platter to the House of Commons, and the House of Commons looks at it and they go, oh, they'll either go, we've looked at the 15 amendments that you've added, we're going to accept 2, but we're sending 13 back, we're not accepting them. Or they might say we're going to send all 15 back, or they might actually in the meantime have realized they're going to have a real problem with the House of Lords, so they end up amending the bill themselves to reflect some of the desires of the House of Lords, which is where I think it gets slightly dangerous, because I don't think people always realize that the law is being changed by the unelected chamber behind the backs of the electorate, as it were, without anyone even knowing. It then goes, so then the House of Commons sends it back to the House of Lords, and the House of Lords says, well, you've accepted 2 of our amendments, you haven't accepted 13, we're now going to amend it again, and then maybe we'll concentrate on 5 new amendments. They say we're going to 5 amendments, we demand you change. They send it back to the House of Commons, and the House of Commons then say, no, all right, we'll accept 2 of your 5, and then it goes back. And eventually the Lords have to give way after you, and it's that process known as ping pong, as it's ping pongs between the 2 houses. So we're just at the final end of the very controversial Rwanda bill, which is about sending people who've arrived illegally on boats to seek asylum in the UK, and the government's proposal is to send them to Rwanda, a 3rd country, before they're able to even have their asylum claims assessed. this has proved to be very controversial, and the Lords keep trying to completely destroy this bill because they don't agree with it. And even though I don't like the bill, my argument is it's not up to us. We're unelected. Even if we don't like this bill, the elected chamber have decided this is what we do. It's one thing trying to, as I say, change it so it's, you know, so it does what it's supposed to do, and you can amend it a bit, but you're basically putting in amendments in bad faith that will rip the guts out of this bill so it won't be able to do what is intended. And instead, what you should do is stand on your own bill and say what you do, etc., etc. So that's what happens.
So, see, it sounds to me that, and we'll talk about the civil service as well in this, that you're getting different branches of government or parliament that instead of doing the duty of the country, what they should be doing, they're almost using it as like an activist platform to like change law within, even though they're unelected. I'm not saying the House of Lords is woke, but do you think that that's happened more and more over the years where people of their own interest have said, actually, we don't like this law, we'll just send it back?
Yeah, I do think that. I think that's one of the dangers of what's happened with the House of Lords, to be honest. And I mean, it might sound daft, but I was surprised when I turned up at the House of Lords how woke the House of Lords was. You know, this is all of the kind of political prejudices and orthodoxies that you find in any student union exist, even if they're with older people in the House of Lords. It's very similar. And that, you know, just to use an example, there's this group called Peers for the Planet. What? And I mean, they're from all parties and they're peers and they're for the planet. And it's like sort of Extinction Rebellion for old people. You know, they're forever standing up talking about the environment, net zero, no matter what their topic is, by the way, you know, housing, they stand up and say, yes, but what about, you know, the planet and all the rest of it. And they are like an activist group, you know, they're well organized, they intervene. Now, I mean, you know, I'm also part of a group of peers who are gender critical. So you could say that I'm also part of an activist group. I take a particular position on biological sex rather than going along with that gender ideology. And we have tried to raise those issues in relation to pieces of legislation in the House of Lords. So, I mean, you know, I have to be careful not to just call double standards. But I think it's important these debates are had out in the Lords. There's nothing wrong with the debates happening. But I think the inference of what you're talking about is very spot on, Chris, which is the danger we've got is when laws are made, legislation is made behind the backs of the electorate. Most people don't think that what happens in the House of Lords changes the laws particularly. And if you've got people in the House of Lords who actually can really shape the, you know, and the laws, by the way, of this country decide who is a free person, you know, who can be locked up. It's criminal laws, you know, these are big decisions. They can decide the targets of how many houses are built or not built. They can have massive implications on people's livelihoods. And that should be completely decided, it seems to me, within the confines of people who are answerable to the electorate. And the point about the House of Lords is it is not answerable to the electorate, and people don't even necessarily know what its role or what it's doing, regardless of its role. And the civil service point is a point well made, because very often that's one of the frustrating things that people have come across of late, which is people vote for things. They voted in a referendum to leave the European Union. They vote for parties they think will, for example, deal with or handle controlling the borders, only to discover that there is people who work in the departments of government who should be enabling those demands of the electorate to happen, who are actually putting up barriers to them happen, saying, no, you can't do that, that's not possible, that won't be possible, and just refusing to implement things. And even government ministers then are tearing their hair out, going, why won't you? And the argument is put forward by many in the civil service who would say this, well, no, we're just simply advising you on the legal parameters on what you can do and what you can't do. But other people would argue that that's a more activist intervention because they disagree politically. And I have found that that is the mood in the House of Lords, which is you disagree politically, you put up barriers to the government being able to implement what they promised they would implement. And even though I don't like a lot of things that the government wants to implement, and I think they could be argued against and can be argued against, to actually just say we don't care about the democratic process seems to me to be irresponsible and anti-democratic.
this is going to sound a weird question because you'll be the House of Lords that'll be scrutinised, and but does it surprise you that there's not like a change in the law to actually stop people in the House of Lords or even civil servants to say, hang on a minute, you can't do this. You've got to, if this comes through, you either comply or you basically quit, but you can't actually prevent.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the House of Lords is likely to pass a law about itself, but
Yeah.
there is no, but there is a convention in the House of Lords that says that, say, after 2 or 3, as it were, ping pongs, the House of Lords has to give way, and they do give way. They don't force the government to do anything, but it's like a war of attrition. And what I'm saying is that the government often give in. Now that's the government's fault. And actually, I think that one thing that's not discussed enough is that I've seen the government accepting amendments at the House of Lords stage that have never been discussed in the Commons. They are only being discussed by the Lords. They're not getting very much publicity because things happening in the Lords aren't given much media coverage. And then the government have kind of quietly done a deal with the front benches of the Lib Dems or the Labour Party, or both usually combined, and some cross benches, amend the law quietly. When the law then goes back to the Commons with these amendments in, even people in the Commons don't know it's been amended that way, because they just they're only looking at the amendments that haven't been accepted by the government when it goes back. They're not kind of going, oh, have they changed that section and made a deal? So I think that although there are rules that they are meant to adhere to, I think there is a little sleight of hand. I think in relation to the civil service, we've got a real problem of a kind of broken social contract with the civil service, I think. And I don't mean every civil servant, of course not. You know, loads, I mean, there's tens and thousands of people who work in the civil service who are, you know, brilliantly doing their jobs, of course. But there is something wrong with senior civil servants indicating their partisan view of things. In fact, Simon, is it MacDonald, Lord MacDonald, in fact, now, he was the head of who was, I can't remember his official position, but he ran the Foreign Office. He recently admitted on a documentary that when the leave vote was announced, when it was announced that we were leaving, that he went and spoke to the weeping members of the Foreign Office civil service who were beside themselves, and he said, and we all obviously disagree with this decision, but you know, I hope you'll all be all right and come and see me if there's anything I can do. You know, it's like, actually, that's an admission of a highly politicized partisan group of people, because even if they did, I mean, first of all, it means that the civil service at the Foreign Office does not reflect the nation, because the majority of the nation wants to leave. So if everybody at the Foreign Office didn't want to leave, that would indicate that they've got a bit of an echo chamber going on. If it's the case, even if that was true, they shouldn't be all crying about it in public and him reassuring them and telling them don't worry, and you know, because they're meant to be impartial. They're meant to be there to do what the government ministers tell them to do. And I'm afraid that, you know, we have got a problem. I don't know that passing a law could change it, because they have got, after all, codes of conduct, and they're meant to have a duty to perform as impartial people who aid and abet and help get the desires of the electorate via the law through into the public life, into the real world. I think that a law wouldn't change it, but I agree with you, something's got to happen in a way, because I think it's making people very cynical about democracy. If you feel, what's the point in voting if these unelected people get in the way, then you decide, well, it's actually, you know, why don't I join one of these unelected groups that can change things behind the scenes? And then we lose faith in our own capacity to shape events via the ballot box, which is obviously the basis of democracy, and the notion that politicians work for, you know, they are the servants, the public servants of the people. And they then, as public servants, have public servants who have to implement what they say via the people. That's the deal. And there's just a massive gap, which is the people are kind of abandoned, going, what happened to what we voted for? Two groups of people not letting us happen.
Maybe not pass a law, but do you think a lot of these problems would be solved if basically politicians, and not just politicians, people in leadership in general, would have more of a backbone
Yes.
because that seems to have been going over the last decade. There seems to be no leadership at all from anyone, and people just capitulate too quickly. And isn't that part of the problem, that politicians really don't have a lot of a backbone? And I mean, they live in an echo chamber, that's one part, but they just don't have the guts to carry out what they want to carry out.
You know, you've hit the nail on the head. You said it better than I can. I mean, that's exactly what we need. And I think that would be more effective than law if they actually, you know, we can recognize there's a problem because, you know, when people like Dominic Raab stood up to civil servants in his department and eventually got kicked out, accused of bullying. And I think that it's possible that Priti Patel, the accusation was leveled at her that she was a bully. Now, I've got no idea. I mean, maybe they were bullies, but one suspects that the people who actually are assertive and say no, or do what you're told, or kind of quite, you know, confront this culture of a refuse-nick atmosphere in parts of the civil service because they won't do things because they politically disagree with them. Really stand up to that, can then find themselves on the receiving end of malicious allegations. And we've also seen, indeed, it was Baroness Kishma Faulkner, who heads up the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, who went in and very sensibly tried to sort out the kind of equalities legislation in relation to gender versus sex. And there was a staff revolt against her, and she really was kind of on the receiving end of some quite unpleasant you know, attacks and nastiness. And then eventually she was accused of bullying. So, you know, it was kind of like that age-old thing, you know, and then there's a big investigation. Anyway, all completely unfounded. She's been completely, in that instance, exonerated, but only after months and months of having to listen to these vile accusations. And so that we know that that kind of "you're a bully" accusation can be used, can be weaponized against people who try and give the kind of leadership which you advocate. On the other hand, one of the reasons why that works is because too few people do it. And if everybody who is in a position of leadership actually did a bit of leadership, and if we saw more solidarity and courage across the piece, so that rather than abandoning someone as soon as they're accused of being bullied, you actually stood by them and said, no, actually, they're just trying to do their job. And that does not mean, by the way, that you shouldn't look at accusations of bullying seriously, because, you know, sure, like all of people listening and everyone else, I've been, you know, a victim of a boss who bullied me years ago, you know, couple actually, and it's highly unpleasant. I'm not saying nothing ever happens, right? But it's also the case that we can't allow just calling someone a bully to mean that people are not allowed to give a lead and show a bit of backbone, as you say, and just say, no, I was elected to do this. I am now running this department. I'm the minister in charge. I'm the undersecretary, whatever it is. This is what's been voted for. You must implement it. And if you don't implement it, it's you that will be facing disciplinary action, not me. And that then rather than them just saying that and then being isolated, that everybody else in the ministry backs them up, and that this is kind of almost like done in public, you know, widely discussed. So say, you have to do this. I'm going on the telly and saying you have to do it. I'm saying if you don't do it, it's not me behaving badly. It's because I'm having a rearguard action of people behind the scenes bad mouthing me. But I want the public to know. But too much of this stuff is kind of like suddenly it just isn't happening. And so I think that we have generally seen a lack of courage in positions of leadership in institutions more generally. Like, sorry, I'll shut up in a minute. But you know, one analogy was I was giving a talk to some very senior members of financial services, and I was talking about the problems of cancel culture and the way that too many organizations and corporations and big businesses were going along with ideas which were fairly reprehensible in relation to equality, diversity, and inclusion policies. And when I say reprehensible policies, what I mean is people who were, you know, fellow employees were basically being hounded out of jobs because they'd said the wrong thing on something. And the senior management were going along with these kind of witch hunts, right? And I was talking about the difficulties of this. And the senior managers in financial services said to me, oh, you're absolutely right. It's terrible. But what can we do? And I said, well, I don't know. You run British financial services. It's quite a powerful position to be in, right? What do you mean, what should we do? You're the CEO. You're the chief financial officer of these major banks and building societies and so on. And they said, yes, but the problem is quite a lot of our young new staff would go mad if we said all that. And you've got this complete inverse of power, which is young graduates maybe going into working, you know, financial services, are being able to threaten, almost blackmail senior management. And then they sort of said, so what can we do? And I said, get a backbone. Do you know what I mean? And if you all stood by each other instead of all saying to me in a closed meeting, you're absolutely right, but what can we do? As though you're kind of like powerless, and the only people with power are the kind of 23-year-old that you've just employed, who you put on the local inclusion committee, who's basically demanded that everybody uses pronouns and anyone who doesn't should be sacked. You know, just say, no, we don't do that in this organisation. And know that everyone in the room will back you up. And they all sheepishly giggled, you know. They knew I was right, but they weren't going to do it.
Well, bearing in mind that happens, why do you think, and it's not, I'm not just talking government, I'm just talking organizations and companies as a whole, why do they still keep on hiring these type of people when even at probably interview stage, you have an inkling that they're going to start with this nonsense about, I'm not going to do it, and so on and so forth. Is it just to promote ideology, or like I said, I haven't got the backbone to say, no, we won't change it?
I think that very often it's more a process driven thing, that it's not like, so I mean, one of the difficulties is a lot of people in HR, in human resources, is one professional category that kind of got what the phrase is captured quite early on with this stuff, because human resources used to be a rather technocratic job, you know, just working out, you know, when the interviews were. I mean, not exactly, but you know what I mean. Have sort of got carried away with themselves as a kind of, you know, obviously they are responsible for hiring and firing to a certain extent. That's what they do, and they've become embroiled in these new categories of what makes somebody the right kind of employee. So the reason I'm saying that is because very often people on the boards of companies or in senior positions don't even know who they're hiring, right? That's one problem. The second problem is that actually the majority of people who are being hired are coming from a culture in which this is the norm, right? So actually what we're saying is like stacked amounts of, you know, original sin, right? So you're not supposed, you know, so most 23-year-olds probably will go along with this or think the same thing, right? But also they get trapped. So I'll give you two quick examples. Some company that I worked with was, you know, felt, and I think that they were cynical about this, that they ought to do more about sustainability and green issues, not because they really believed in it, because they were worried that they might be seen to not be doing their bit for the environment. So they hired in somebody who'd worked from one of the big green NGOs, you know, Greenpeace or what have you. I don't think it was Greenpeace, but it doesn't matter, right? Somebody like that. Hired him in, box ticked, they think, right? But they get this guy in, and he then says, I really could do with another couple of assistants, you know, right? I could do, you know, we need to, and we're going to organize a kind of recycling scheme, right? Or something, right? And so they think, oh, a bit harmless. All right, we'll get those two in. And the next minute, you've got these like 3 people wandering around reporting anyone who's not recycling properly, right? And then they say, we need to do more on this. And then, anyway, to cut a long story short, by the time he finished, this person had a department of, you know, 30 people, and people were being sacked for not going along with him, and he had a seat on the board. And the people who had originally employed him for greenwashing purposes, rather cynically, didn't know how to stop this sort of train on its kind of trajectory, because they didn't want to be accused of being cynical or being weak on the environment. So they kind of kept agreeing to it. And eventually he became so powerful that he became like more important almost than the people who'd employed him. And I think that's often happens. It's sort of almost an unintentional consequence of things, is that. And then I was reading today about what happened at the Tavistock Clinic in relation to young people turning up at Tavistock for treatment because they gender confused, and you know, all of the controversy around that in relation to the cash review. But anyway, one thing that was really telling was that there was a woman who was on Newsnight last night who's very supportive, a trans woman who's very supportive of affirming care that means that young people are given puberty blockers and so on and so forth. Anyway, she, as a trans woman, it was revealed today that she was involved. She's a former patient of the Tavistock, and the Tavistock, like all NHS trusts these days, say, oh, well, we have to have a board that involves patients to represent patient views. And so this trans woman became the patient on representing patient views at the Tavistock. The fact that this person was an activist is now that, you know, that's what they originally. So that's one thing, they're on some board, right? There's then a decision that the patient representative patients ought to be on job interviews to appoint clinicians, i.e. the people, clinicians, right? You know, obviously, no disrespect, but this transgender woman knows nothing about clinical practice, right? It's a patient. And this will be true, by the way, when we talk about cancer any more than anything else, right? In this instance, you can see the political implications. And this transgender woman then describes how, in that role of selecting clinicians, that this transgender woman, I keep going to say she, want to say he, don't know what to say, I'm in a kerfuddle. So anyway, this person said that it was a real big change that in the way that people were being interviewed, because people were asked to use their pronouns when they introduce themselves. And rather than just showing an empathy for working with young people, they showed a particular empathy for the suffering of trans children. First of all, there is no such thing as a trans child, by the way, just an aside. There might be gender confused young people, but that's not the same. But then I thought, and it's also been involved in 30 interviews for clinical practitioners. So I don't suppose anyone planned that. Do you see what I mean? It's just that the processes, and nobody stopped it. That's the main thing. You know, somebody should have said, what on earth is this trans woman doing interviewing clinicians with us who do know something about clinical practice? But nobody says it. And eventually, therefore, the people who were recruited to the jobs are people who were sympathetic to an activist mentality when it came to affirming young people, or one can assume based on what was said. So I think that it's like a roller coaster. It's a sort of, you can't stop it. And that's one of the difficulties we've got. Unless you have a really big public outcry and a big public debate, it's almost like these things happen and people think, oh, it's too much. You know, you imagine if you're at HR, you think, oh God, I can see this is a disaster, but I don't want to be the one who goes, can you get that trans woman off the interview panel, please? Because you're going to be accused of transphobia and bigotry, and you don't want to do it. And you don't want to be seen to be doing it.
That's crazy. That's like, I mean, if you want the experience of someone, a person like that, then do it in a testimony. But why would you to have it on a board? It just seems bizarre to me. And again, I don't know why you would quickly give away that power and influence you have based on your experience to someone else. It just seems odd to me. And it's not just, we're not talking about just trans issues, but just in general. I don't know why these people just feel to give up this power. It just seems
because
odd.
it's all, everything's cloaked in this sort of power relations. So it's like very much kind of like, oh, we've got too much power. Maybe we can dissipate our power by sharing it. So, you know, you actually see these things in education. And one of the things I most objected to when I was teaching in further education were student feedback forms and student satisfaction forms. And I used to say, not being funny, but why are you asking a bunch of 16-year-olds who I teach how they feel about, you know, what I teach or how I teach? Let me tell you, they hate it when I have to teach Henry IV Part 1 because it's boring, right? And they don't want to do it. And my job is to, by the end of the course, that they go, it wasn't as bad as I thought. In fact, quite a good play, really. But they're not going to like enthusiastically go, we want Henry IV Part 1 in West Arts College in Watford on a Friday afternoon when I was teaching them. The last thing they wanted me to do was to come in and make them bloody do any work, right? I mean, of course not. I wasn't popular. But by the way, by the end, I sort of was a bit popular, but that's the difference. If you ask them, your average 16-year-old doesn't want that. But we moved to a situation where the head of department was saying, in the feedback forms, there seems to be some resistance to some of the more classical texts being taught by certain members of staff. And could we not find texts that are more relevant and interesting for the pupils? And, you know, and that was early days, by the way, that's like 25 years ago. This, at this stage, is institutionalized. And it was always sort of thing about, we don't want anyone to think that we're saying we know best. Like, well, God, if we don't know what best, why are we the teachers of English literature, A level? That's mad. I mean, we do know more than they do. That's the whole point. But somehow this was kind of seen as some kind of like a dominating spirit, you know, again, a bit bullying, a bit overzealous, you know, can't we? And so what I'm saying is that's been a gradual erosion of adult authority in relation to young people. And I think there's been a gradual erosion of expertise when it comes to certain professions, at least, where people do, you know, it's like when you go to the doctor and they say, do you want, you know, would you like to have the operation? And you go, I don't know, you're the bloody doctor. And they go, yes, but it's like co-medical or something, you know, I can't remember what they call something. And it's like, I want you to tell me, should I have the operation or not, doctor? And they're a bit like, well, on the one hand, you might say that in the olden days, and I mean, you know, I'm not glorifying them, God knows, that we were too deferential, that you went to the doctor and they said black, and even though you knew it was white, you kind of went, all right, doctor, and you kind of walked out, right? That might be true. But on the other hand, this sort of like cowardly inability for people to assert that they do know best, really, in these certain instances, and like you say, as sort of infected places it shouldn't. There are things that they don't know best about, like how you live your life, right? I mean, the elite drive me mad because they interfere in things that got nothing to do with them. You know what I mean? Like, how dare they tell me how to rear my kids, or what to eat, or all the rest of it. But there are times when I want them to say, I am in charge of this. I'm going to be the powerful voice, etc., etc.
Yeah, I just despair a lot of his stuff. I mean, this has been going on for over a decade now, and I do just despair. But it's interesting because I've just finished reading Tony Sewell's new book.
Oh, brilliant. Great.
It's a brilliant book. And one of the things he talks about with regards to kids and the initiatives they're trying to get black kids in to do better is he got rid of the DI stuff and just made sure there were good teachers and good head teachers that are running the schools. And one of the things that stands out with me that we could use the wider discussion is the kids actually respected those boundaries, in the sense of, if you had people in there who told them what to do and made sure that the red lines were crossed, they actually respected that. And to bring it out to society, I think if you did that in society as a whole, eventually people would respect that because at least they know where they stand. Whereas at the moment, it's like a free for all.
I completely agree, and I'm a great admirer of Tony Sewell's work, not just his book, but the book explaining what his work is, but also explaining his life experiences as well. And I hope that you'll try and get him on the podcast, Chris. That would be
Yeah,
great.
definitely.
Are you going to try and do that?
Yeah, definitely. Because I mean, I've heard some of his stuff before, and it's just incredible, that book, because he doesn't shy away from racism. It's not one of those where
No.
he literally just says this is even stuff I didn't know, like, that happened in his country. So yeah, for sure, it's definitely one I want to get on. But that point about the boundaries and respect,
Yes, I
I
agree,
think if
and
you had
I
it all
think
right,
that's
yeah.
right, yeah. And I think actually the funny thing about it is, I mean, you know, the one of the projects that we're involved in here is a schools debating competition called Debating Matters.
Mhm.
And I mentioned that because one of the aspects of the way that the format works is that after the students, sixth formers have, you know, argued, you know, for or against the motion, 3 minutes each, for, 3 against, 3 for, 3 against. Rather than it just being kind of like a kind of clever game of political rhetoric, or, you know, he makes a smart arse's comments, they're then cross-examined by 3 adult judges who kind of go, well, it's already well you saying that, Chris, but what about this? And can you justify what you've just said there? You know, Claire, you know, you know, you speak a lot, but is there any substance to it? I want to really dig down and see if you're just showing off and all. Anyway, so when we first started that competition, and even today, there's an element of this. Quite a lot of people are really shocked at the sort of temerity of like asking these young people like to justify what they've just said and putting them under pressure. And you know, they and not immediately saying, "Oh, aren't you all brilliant?" You know what I mean? And people say, "Well, isn't it bad for these young people's self-esteem if you're too critical?" It's like, no, because you know, it's patronising to say every speech you've ever heard by a 16-year-old is brilliant per se. I mean, no, it's not, is it? We all know that's not true. Some of them will be brilliant, some will be rubbish, right? And actually, and this is where the boundaries point comes in. When we started doing it, and at the end, then the judges sum up and give them feedback, you know, and sort of say, look, you know, you're really good at this, but you're really rubbish at this, or, you know, whatever. It's just not, in other words, you don't just pat them on the back for being 16, 17 and joining in. Right? Everyone said, oh, this will be really demoralizing. But the people who really loved the format were the sixth formers, because actually, if you're young, you actually kind of need to know what the boundaries are. You know, actually, you want adults who show you a bit of, you take you seriously enough to say, that wasn't very good. Do you know what I mean? You talked, you didn't do enough work. You know what I mean? You can't just lazily wander in here and just like spout all this. You don't have to be cruel about it, but actually, they liked a little bit of, and they found it, all the feedback we got was like these young people saying it was quite refreshing to have people not just kind of butter us up because we're young. And I think that the point that Tony Sewell is making very often is that the people in charge have just ceded control to young people. And it's an insult to young people. It looks like it's a compliment, you know, oh, lovely young people, you know, we'll let you run things. But actually, it's an abdication of responsibility. By people who run education, they should, in fact, be firm, set clear boundaries for people. Everybody knows where they are, right? It's much better for everyone. And actually, in the end, although a lot of particularly young people whinge when there's rules that they don't like, we're all the same. I mean, and you can be old and whinge, you know what I mean? It's like, why do I have to do this, right? Well, you know, why do I have to get up in the morning? Why do I have to go to work? Why do I? Well, we all feel like that all the time. But if we just indulged ourselves, well, nothing had ever happened in the world. And actually, when you go out into the world, you discover that by going out into the world, by getting up and going out, actually things are all right and quite good, actually. You can change things, right? Otherwise, we're just always sitting at home hiding. So I think that those are very important points. And it's a real shame that we've abandoned them.
Yeah. And you've led me, speaking about debating matters, you've led me on to my next point, which is the battle of ideas. Because how long has it been running for now?
It'll be its 20th anniversary next year. Can you believe? I can't believe it myself. But yeah, 20 years. 19th Battle of Ideas this year.
So obviously I can understand, and I'm not saying, I mean, obviously I spoke there last year, so I know how good it is, but and I know you're a champion of free speech, but what was the reason for starting an event like that? Because that's a massive event to get started.
Yeah. I think it was partly because, you know, I was really conscious, not just me, but there was a group of us, and I felt very conscious of the fact that there had previously been two traditions that were going. One was there was a kind of political tradition of, you know, open public debates and discussions like hustings at election times, and I don't mean the kind of rubbish hustings in church halls you have now, but like where large numbers would turn up and, you know, people had to, and he wanted to be elected, had to face the public. But it wasn't just around election time. There was regular town hall meetings and a real kind of robust public square in which ordinary people were able to discuss and talk about what was going on. And that was kind of draining away when we kind of entered into the age of technocratic politicians. You know what I mean? Like the Blair era. I'm not blaming Blair because it wasn't just him, but it was kind of like this idea of politicians not really standing for anything, just being able, you know, we're good managers, you know, trust us, we'll get on with it, you know. And so it kind of it lost part of what that meant was the professionalization of politics, the professionalization even of trade unions, because trade unions were also another arena in which quite lively public debate and the civil society in general, you know, everything from the, oh, I don't know, you know, even, you know, things like the Girl Guides when I was young, you know, they'd have like big discussions and debate. It was all sorts of places, right, where, you know, it didn't matter, you know, churches even were places of civil society where people kind of really engaged. That kind of was just completely on the wane, and you can't reproduce it, you know that. But I thought there was a gap in the market for trying to create a new form of civil society public discussion. And the other thing was is that because I was an educator and a teacher, I was very concerned about how deadening student life was. And I don't just mean university life, but people going to further education colleges, staying on at school or whatever, which was that, you know, when I went to university, and there was lots of things to hate about when I went to university, but the one thing that you did get was you got a really vibrant culture of political discussion and engagement and everybody arguing. So, you know, I was like forever, you know, forever getting roused, not just me. 1,000 people used to go to union general meetings of the student union. Can you believe that? There was like activism in lots of places, but even the seminar rooms are really lively. You were arguing about novels and music, and you know, everything was like that, right? And so and that started to go because everything was like go to university to get qualifications so that you can get a job. That kind of like, and you got the beginnings of what was known then as political correctness. So on the one hand, you've got these professionalized politicians who, by the way, the introduction of the spin doctor really symbolized what I most hated, you know, that politicians would you know, practice what they spoke, so they didn't put a word out of place. You know, everything was for a PR audience. And also you've got this kind of completely deadened university sector or colleges that were, as I say, just kind of you know, factories for acquiring qualifications without any of the kind of robustness about access to knowledge. An atmosphere in general of political correctness where increasingly people were saying you can't say that, you can't say that, you can't say that, you can't say that. Now, not as bad as now, but we could see that maybe that 20 years ago, right? So I thought, oh, maybe we could kind of like bring everyone together and like have a big town hall type of event. And I'd also organise a few big events for a magazine that I was involved in, LM magazine. And I could see that there was a real appetite for like live events, people just arguing and discussing. So that's where it came from. Didn't expect it to be so big. I don't think I expected it to last so long. And I didn't expect it to be so important. And when we brought out the slogan, free speech allowed, it wasn't like we didn't put a lot of work, we didn't get a branding company in to do it, right? We just thought it sounded like, all right, yeah. But free speech allowed, when you say that's the slogan of the Battle of Ideas Festival, we go, oh, very revolutionary. Because free speech itself has become such a controversial, it's like sort of, no, we didn't mean that. It's like, what? And the other thing, and I think I know that because of work that you've done and everything, one of the things that I was getting kind of, I was doing a lot of talks at book festivals, and there were sort of things like book festivals on. I'd be like asked to speak or chair, and what happened was, you know, you'd have an hour and a quarter given over. You get there, right, and like the speaker would speak for like 50 minutes, the chair would speak for 10, and then they say, we've got plenty of time for discussion, we've got 8 minutes. And then you'd like take 2 questions, and then they'd always say, questions only, ask the speaker, we don't want contributions. Whereas the very opposite was true of the Battle of Ideas and continues to be so, which is even famous people only get to speak for 5 to 10 minutes, max 10 minutes, largely. And usually it's like 5 to 7 minutes and can be 3 to 4, I think, when you were speaking. You know, it's like it's tight, right? And then there's respondents, and it's all very fast and furious, but half the time it's given over to the audience. So what we were trying to do was hold a series of public conversations. So it was, the panels are really important. I mean, if you hadn't written that letter on liberty on boxing, there wouldn't be anything to discuss. So of course you're important, right? That's like important. And then you've written it, and then there's a few people on your panel with you who are responding because they've read what you've written and they've got something to say. But
Yeah.
also what makes the discussion come alive is then the people in the audience who then want to join in, right? And then you have a conversation. Now, what's the point of writing the pamphlet on boxing if it's kind of just a dead tone? You know what I mean? For us, that would work. So you know, Chris Acker speaks on boxing, no disrespect here, is one thing, right? But it's actually Chris Acker's is creating a discussion on boxing that has ripples beyond, because it's a conversation and it makes everyone interested. And that's the way we approach all of it. So that was the other thing, was we could see that the professionalization of both politics and the university and college sector and the education sector was squeezing out the importance of public in the public debate bit. The public were the ones who have been told to shut up and listen. And we thought, no, it's the other way around. The politicians got to listen to the public a bit more.
Are there any particular guests over the 19 years that have stood out?
There are one or two, but I have to say that it's not really starry like that. We've tried to avoid, I mean, we haven't gone for, I don't mean that we don't have any big names, but I can't say that's quite what it's like. But there was an in conversation with Camille Paglia, who's one of my sort of heroines from American academia and feminism, who is just like, I mean, she's like a rock star of kind of philosophy. And she was, you know, she was quite sort of scarily difficult in as much as, you know, she's kind of like, these kind of big American names when they turn up, they're not, you know, you kind of, we had to kind of look after her, let's put it that way. But she was absolutely brilliant. It was brilliant having her there, and that I did an in conversation with her, and I really loved it. I've also enjoyed people, you know, I think that there's some novelists and artists over the years. I think that I've enjoyed Lionel Shriver, who, by the way, has got a new novel out at the moment called Mania, and I've read it, and I'd like to recommend it to people. And it's not, it's an absolute romp of a read, but it also raises some very difficult issues. Let me tell you, it's not like you know, you read it and think, oh my God, did that really get said? It's like amazing book. And I saw her last night, so it's reminded me. But Lionel Shriver was absolutely brilliant doing the in conversation again. Again, Lionel Shriver is like awkward, right? And I mean that as a compliment. You know, she's not like, don't do an ingratiating in conversation with her, and she doesn't do an ingratiating conversation back. I mean, she was kind of quite fierce, and we were kind of sparring a bit. And of course, it was brilliant for the audience because, again, they had access to this thinking out loud conversation in a way. It wasn't prepared. It wasn't planned in a sort of meticulous way. And the audience could then ask questions well, and Lionel could say anything and so on. But I really mean this, and it sounds slightly twee. The things that stand out for me about the Battle of Ideas over the years, the things that made the hair stand on the back up on the back of my neck is some 17-year-old shouting at David Aaronovitch and saying he didn't know what he was talking about. And rather than that being a precocious young teenager, he then went on to explain with some detail why David Aaronovitch was wrong. And he was, and I thought, and David Aaronovitch in that instance, you know, was like slightly shamed. And I'm not saying that to have a go at David Aaronovitch. What I meant was David Aaronovitch is, even though he and I don't get on now, you know, politically, actually he's a formidable, you know, writer, and he's like a big name. And they've got this like young person standing up saying, well, it's already whether you saying that, David, what about this? And in the words, it's like that bit where real genuine and as it happens, to his credit, David Aaronovitch said, well, I hadn't really thought. He was a bit taken aback, and I think he was tempted to say, who the hell are you? But actually he realized that actually there was something in what this person said. So there's things like that. It's the number of people who said over the years that the Battle of Ideas is like, you know, it offers solidarity. I don't mean on issues necessarily. I mean, there are obviously issues where people who maybe are gender critical feel, well, God, I can go there and not get accused of bigotry. But it's not even that you agree, but you know that you can trust the people who are there. not to shout, I find that offensive, and walk off in a huff. And so it's more the spirit of open-mindedness that's important. And that, I still get a buzz. Not all the sessions work. You know, some of the panels aren't quite what you want them to be. You think, oh, I really wanted that panel to be like this, and it wasn't. Others, you think, that was the best thing I've ever chaired in my life, or I've sat and listened, I thought, oh my God, I didn't expect that to be so good. Others, you think, oh, that didn't work. But something's happening in the room, something exciting's happening. And it always gives me faith in the capacity for ordinary people to shape the world that we live in and shape the future. And that's what it's all about.
Just briefly then as well, what are your thoughts, not just, I can imagine what you're going to say, on the Scottish hate speech bill, and also how it's developed over its first week of establishment?
Well, it's obviously been, you know, amusing to watch the Scottish police drowning in the number of complaints that have been raised. And undoubtedly, some of this has been slightly mischievous because the police threatened that they would investigate every single complaint that was made. So they've now been inundated with complaints. A lot of those complaints have actually been levelled at the Scottish First Minister, which is kind of like with a sense of irony, because he made a speech once, an anti-white speech, as people have called it, and there's been that. There's a load of complaints in about J.K. Rowling, and then there's, you know, there is, as predicted, you know, a whole range of complaints which the police said, oh no, that's not a hate crime. And then everyone's going, well, what is a hate crime? We don't know what it is now, because they've so it's easy at this point to kind of see it as being a floundering mess that will never actually work because the police can't cope with it. But that's actually, I think, to underestimate the dangers of it, because I think the fact that Police Scotland has set up reporting booths all over Scotland so that you can go in and report hate creates an atmosphere of institutionalized snitching, of encouraging people to hear the worst in what someone says. You know, the points that I was just making about the Battle of Ideas Festival, you know, rather than hearing somebody say something and taking them at face value and not assuming that what they're saying is, you know, driven by hate and kind of running behind their back to report it, but rather saying, what do you mean? I mean, we should call people out, by the way, like you said about Tony Sowell. You know, think something's racist, say, God, that's racist, right? I'm not suggesting you go, oh, what an interesting point of view. Go, that's right, everything is racist, say it, right? But to kind of like go, oh, I think that's racist, so I'm going to go to the reporting booth set up by Police Scotland and report on that person. It's also encouraging people to report on speech they hear that's not directed at them. So it really does create an atmosphere of, it's inevitably going to lead to malicious, you know, misuse, because people are going to be, you know, reporting their neighbour who they think has grown too big a hedge or something, you know what I mean? They're in some dispute with. The fact that they've removed the dwellings defence is very dangerous, because that's the protection that says that you can say behind closed doors whatever you want, right? In your own home, in the privacy of your own space. They've removed that, which obviously means that you can be having like mates round for dinner, you know, their mate brings a mate who you don't know very well. He decides that something you said is a hate crime, and you can go and complain about it. And obviously, in a period in which we all know that there's slight tensions between parents and children, particularly on contentious issues like gender, where you've maybe got some 14-year-old girl who's saying, I demand that you allow me to have puberty blockers, and I demand that you call me Mark, not Mandy, and I demand that you use them right. And the parents are saying, don't be daft, we love you regardless, you can call yourself what you want, but we're not doing it, or, you know, whatever, right? There might be tensions, that's all I'm saying. And it's hard enough negotiating with that, right? It's hard enough working out how you're going to stop your 16-year-old, you know, accessing, you know, hardcore porn on their phone and take it away, and they accuse you of, you know, undermining their human rights or something. Now, the Scottish state's encouraging the kids to go and report their parents for a hate crime, right? I mean, it's unbelievably dangerous. So I think that that we've all had a lot of fun with their kind of red furry hate monster and think it's like, you know, kind of what fools they've made of themselves. But I actually am fearful that it does actually still create an atmosphere in which we've institutionalized the notion that hate should be a matter of censorship and that the state should be allowed to do it. And then people say, if the bill was better drawn up and hate better defined, it's like, no, don't want any of that. The only other thing which has just not been commented on enough, I think it's been understandable that because the bill emerged in relation to the controversy around the gender self-ID question, that the issue has been dominated around pronoun use and whether you call a transgender woman a woman or a man in crime statistics, what prison they go to, all of these controversies that we're familiar with. And because obviously an internationally renowned author like J.K. Rowling has swayed in on this, that we think it's all about that issue. And that some people are saying, oh, they brought this bill in particularly to criminalize gender critical feminists and so on. I think that's not true. And it's not also the main focus of the bill. The bill actually is explicit that its main target, Police Scotland videos on this have said their main target, 18 to 30-year-old males, white, who are disgruntled and feel that they are victims of the EDI and they're not, and that they're kind of and have taken their grievance into hate, effectively, right? And then you think, well, just hold on a minute, you've now identified potential hate criminals, right? Our category of people, which is in fact, oh yeah, and they said from poor socioeconomic backgrounds. So basically, talking about white working class males under 30, and you're in trouble, right? And that is as divisive and as dangerous as anything else. Can you imagine what football match is going to be like? Celtic Rangers is going to be a hoot. I mean, it's bad enough. It's bad enough as it is, right?
Mhm.
But you know, you want an example of people shouting hate at each other, just go to football, right? And I'm not suggesting they should be all rounded up and arrested. But I mean, if the police are going to seriously have everybody phoning in their hate line, going and reporting in their report centres and say they're going to investigate, ridiculous. But chilling and dangerous.
Claire, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. If people want to know more information about the Battle of Ideas and Academy Ideas, where can I go to?
Yeah, so I'm going to get some of this wrong, but it's battleofideas.org.uk. But can I just actually encourage people to sign up to our Substack? I say that because it's our one-stop shop, and we put everything there, and we also have articles, and it's where we promote the Letters on Liberty. And that's actually Claire Fox's Substack, so it's Claire Fox and the Academy of Ideas. Please do sign up and, you know, keep in touch with us. Come to, you know, if you're under 30, we've got something called Living Freedom. If you're any age at all, come to a residential weekend called the Academy, which this year is on the Clash of Civilizations, or whether civilization's under threat, under siege, I think it's what it's called. And yes, the Battle of Ideas, because I mean, look, Chris has spoken. Chris is going to hopefully be back.
Yeah,
And we would welcome you all, whatever your opinions, left or right, whatever social background, come along and have your say.
absolute pleasure, Claire. Thank you for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you, Chris. It's been enjoyable.